Welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, December 18th, 2023, and today I was coming across my feed on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, and an article from Politico really struck out to me as one that I thought was very fascinating looking ahead to the 2024 Senate elections. This article is about the Senate GOP's strategy for the 2024 elections and the candidates that they are willing and opting to put up in some of these battleground states. As you can tell from the title of this video, I am not necessarily looking at this from a positive lens. I think a lot of what has been mentioned in this article, alongside a lot of reports we've seen from external press, has shown that the Republican Party is set up to set another failing slate of electors going into the upcoming Senate elections. Now, when Senator Steve Daines of Montana took over the National Republican Senatorial Committee, or known as the NRSC, there was a lot of enthusiasm around his pick, largely because he was set to change the way the GOP approached primaries, meaning that the NRSC would get directly involved in Senate primaries to prop up candidates that he deemed as more electable. This was coming off a Senate election year in which Democrats actually gained seats in the United States Senate. I just showed you 2018. That's important later on, but specifically we're focused on 2022 when Democrats were able to win more seats than they already had in the 2022 midterm elections in a year that was meant to be a Republican wave. And it wasn't just, a pickup for Democrats that sold in the fact that Republicans had a number of losses across these elections. It was the margins that accompanied the Democratic Party's victories in many of these battleground states. For instance, in the state of Pennsylvania, we saw that John Fetterman defeated Dr. Oz, the candidate that there saw no major party intervention by any major political figure besides Donald Trump benefiting Dr. Oz in this circumstance, in which we saw that John Fetterman defeated Dr. Oz by a margin of 5 percentage points. And again, it wasn't just there. In the state of Arizona, Mark Kelly defeated Blake Masters despite the polls saying that Blake Masters was going to win by a margin of roughly 5 points. Even in states where Republicans were expecting to narrow up the margins, given that they were choosing a Republican at the time, or not necessarily on the national level, but the voters had chosen a Republican that came across as more moderate, though Republicans had their own quarrels and considerations when it came down to this race. Colorado is one of these states where Michael Bennet defeated Joe O'Dea, a pro-choice Republican, by a 15-point margin for someone who some Republicans thought had a realistic shot at flipping Colorado from blue to red. And so looking across this map, the Republican Party had far from an impressive display of victory. In Ohio, J.D. Vance won by just 6 percentage points, despite it being a state that Donald Trump won by around 8 in the last election. In New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan won by a whopping 10 percentage points across a state that Joe Biden had won by roughly 7 points, and Hillary Clinton had won against Donald Trump in 2016 by less than a point. The point being, you find that a lot of these states where the Republican Party did not take immediate action resulted in a lot of losses. And there was one very, very standard conventional common denominator across many of these failing candidates. And it was their association with Donald Trump and their ideas around election denialism and their refusal to accept the last election. And so we found that many of those Republicans, not only alone in the Senate races, but also across numerous House races, across numerous governor races, they ended up losing. So just looking at Kari Lake, who actually is mentioned in this article that we are about to explore, in the fact that she lost her election, in an election that many people expected her to win, that the polls had showed her winning by around 4 points, largely because of her association with what was perceived as extremist ideology, alt-right ideology, election denialism, hard on different issues that she should not have been hard on, being extremely pro-life, being exceptionally, anti-LGBT when it came down to many of the pieces of policy and rhetoric, things that she was spouting as a mainstream Republican, as someone who's representing a more moderate, honestly, Republican Party, had leaned very much into the Make America Great Again wing of the party, ultimately ended up losing as voters had already rejected this ideology 2 years prior. And it wasn't just here. It happened in states like Kansas and Maine and Michigan and Oregon and Pennsylvania. And that was really where you found, and Wisconsin, especially there, was really where you found that this proved there was a common denominator here, an association with President Trump that resulted in losses in numerous competitive races that would have otherwise been deemed as winnable. So what changed now that we're heading into 2024? Well, apparently not much. You see, the Republican Party has been very aware that they lost the last election. I don't think that they are leaning as much into the 2020 election idea that this was a stolen election by the Democratic Party, spouting lies and rhetoric. That's not what they're going after. That's not what they're looking to do. What they tried to do, at least, and so I don't know how effective it was, they used a reflective method looking at the state of the races. They looked at the candidates they put up. They looked at the common denominator being Donald Trump. For a while, they rejected this idea that Donald Trump should have any influence within the GOP after the 2022 midterms. We now know that is no longer the case. But for a while, they were understanding that there were candidates who lost them the election because of how unpopular they were, because of how extreme they were. And so you fast forward to where we are today, the expectation was that the NRSC and the mainstream GOP would intentionally stack candidates in races that are more competitive, that are more electable, so a repeat of 2022 doesn't happen. But that simply is not the case. As suggested by these high-level takeaways here, we can see that the GOP is, quote, making big moves ahead of a critical stretch for trying to win back the Senate. They're trying to clear the lake for Kari Lake, the Republican nominee for governor in Arizona who lost in the last election, refused to concede her election, and is continuing down this idea of extremism. Now, she is walking it back slightly, but she's by no means the most electable Republican. J.D. Vance, the other senator from Ohio, is trying to pitch to the NRSC on Bernie Moreno in Ohio. Now, this primary is just around 3 months away. And the reason why this matters is because Bernie Moreno is easily the weakest candidate on the ballot. You also find that Republicans are actively trying to keep out Matt Rosendale. Yes, it is a good idea, and in practice and in theory, this would be beneficial to them. But they aren't doing it effectively enough that Matt Rosendale is actively tweeting about the United States Senate, meeting with people like President Donald Trump, and flaunting this in front of the face of the GOP. And he knows that he is perceived as the weaker candidate, which is why he does this, largely to build up more name recognition for himself and to counteract many of the attacks he will eventually receive once he announces his Senate bid. But clearly, the NRSC is not doing enough, and in some instances are doing a little too much for candidates that could potentially lose them the all-important Senate races. There aren't that many in 2024. Around 8 races will determine the true balance of power in the United States Senate, and chances are Democrats are going to win a lot of them. They have a strong candidate list across the 3 Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. History tells us that Nevada probably isn't going to go blue or going to go red. Jackie Rosen won in 2018, defeating a Republican incumbent by around 5 points, larger than any Democratic victory in any election since 2014 onward. So you see that Democrats have a pretty strong stacked list across Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania that reduces down to around 4 toss-up states. Texas will probably go red. That brings the Republicans to 50. West Virginia, I already had as red, flipping to the GOP. That one's not going to be competitive, though Democrats currently have an incumbent there. That's Joe Manchin's seat. So now we're down to 3. Well, here's the problem. If Matt Rosendale ends up as the nominee in Montana, and the reason why he shouldn't be is because he has already lost this election. In 2018, Matt Rosendale was the Republican nominee for Senate. He loses to Jon Tester by around 4 points. You know who's back in 2024? Senator Jon Tester, who also might be back again, Representative Matt Rosendale. But the voters have already made a decision on that front, and Matt Rosendale, quite frankly, has a very good shot at winning the primary in 2024. So take Montana out of the fray. Now we're going down to Ohio and Arizona. Well, as I mentioned, Bernie Moreno in the state of Ohio will be facing off against an incumbent Democrat who won in 2018 by around 7 points. I point that out because Donald Trump, prior to that election, won the state by 8 points in 2016. And then looking at 2024, it is clear Sherrod Brown will win the nomination, but on the Republican side, there are plenty of stronger candidates here, specifically Matt Dolan, or quite frankly, even Frank LaRose, despite his association with Issue 1, would be stronger candidates than Bernie Moreno. And you know what happens when you take a look at what the general election data seems to suggest? Every single Republican candidate besides Bernie Moreno performs better than Bernie Moreno. Even no names do better than him because people don't like Bernie Moreno. And yet, in primary polling data recently, he is starting to take a lead. And that matters because it shows that the Republican Party is at a point where they could nominate somebody who might be on track to lose to a Democratic senator in a Trump plus 8 state. And the fact is, not only is just this a circumstance of where the primary voters are slightly leaning towards, it is also the product of endorsements being made by notable Republicans in the Senate, notable Republicans across the country, and the most notable Republican, besides the governor, in the state of Ohio being Senator J.D. Vance, who was just elected in that state in 2022, coming out in complete support of Bernie Moreno, which is largely why we see these numbers turning in his favor in the primary. But clearly, he is the weakest candidate. And like I said, with the state of Arizona, don't even get me started on Kari Lake. She is far from the strongest candidate, even though there is a consideration that Kyrsten Sinema might run for re-election as an independent and potentially split the vote between the Democrats and those who lean towards the Democrats but identify as independents, allowing the Republicans to win. That is a concern that some Democrats have that Republicans are hoping for. But even in three-way races, because Kari Lake is so unpopular and Ruben Gallego is a strong Democratic candidate, he beats both of these candidates, even in a race where you have a lot of the Democratic Party vote share split, and especially in head-to-head races, Ruben Gallego defeats Kari Lake in a similar way that we saw Katie Hobbs defeat her back in 2022. So I look at this and I am honestly astounded that Bernie Moreno is even being pitched and potentially will even be chosen by the NRSC if he ends up becoming a more clear favorite. Kari Lake potentially trying to clear the field for one of the weakest nominees that we saw in 2022, given the circumstance and given the Democratic opponent at the time. In Montana, the possibility that Matt Rosendale might come back, on top of the fact that the NRSC hasn't even contained that race for Tim Sheehy yet, is a red flag. And that also opens up the opportunity that maybe other states will start to become competitive, specifically states like Texas, where Ted Cruz already faced a very competitive race in his last election in 2018 and very well could face another competitive one up in 2024, depending on who the Democrats nominate, and their bench, quite frankly, isn't too bad. So I look at this map and I say, guessing on the GOP strategy, this isn't the strongest way to go. By any metric, this is probably one of the worst ways we could see the NRSC or the Senate GOP in its entirety move ahead of the next elections. This is a tried and done slate of candidates. I mean, you have people here who have already lost races not even a year ago or a year and a half ago that want to go for another point of office. And, in cases like Kari Lake, haven't even conceded their last races. I think what we will find is that the GOP may end up with a similar result in 2024, where they had an extremely good opportunity at winning back Senate control, and they fail to do so because they cannot win over the voters in the key battleground states that matter, because the candidates they have nominated are unlikable, are perceived as extreme, and the Democrats ultimately come ahead. That was the pitfall for Herschel Walker in Georgia, for Adam Laxalt in Nevada, for Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, for Blake Masters in Arizona. These states where Republicans were very hopeful on Election Day, genuinely thought they were going to win, and in a lot of the polls, they suggested that Republicans were going to win. But they ended up losing because they did not have strong candidates, and Democrats did. And I think the biggest takeaway that I received from 2022 is that the NRSC, the RNC, the NRCC needs to play a bigger role in vetting these candidates, in fielding these candidates, in running these candidates, and clearing the field, and if not, ensuring that the right, most electable candidate wins the primary. Because the primary, more often than not, is comprised of extremely partisan voters. The most passionate members of the party are the most likely to vote in primaries. That's how we end up with extremely polarizing representatives in districts that are gerrymandered, so it's this self-reinforcing cycle. But looking at the Senate elections, the Republican Party, because it's so wide, because these races are statewide, they have the opportunity to change things around. They at least have the opportunity to use their influence to push for strong, formidable general election candidates. And as of right now, we are not seeing that. I do not think that the GOP is done for 2024. I think they could realistically win the White House, the House, and the Senate. But I could also see a reality in which they win none of them. And I could see a reality in which they are mixed and matched. I think presently speaking, Republicans are the favorites to win the Senate. And presently speaking, Democrats are the favorites to win the House. but never underestimate the Republican Party's ability to lose a Senate race, a congressional race, overall control from something that was so easily within their grasp, maybe even months prior to the election. There are reasons we look at this and scoff at the idea of Kari Lake running for Senate yet again, or running for another elected office in Arizona following her last one, because she clearly was rejected by voters once, and I can nearly guarantee you they will do it again. The GOP needs to rework its strategy. We thought they learned their lesson after 2022, and in some cases it seems like they might have. But the NRSC needs to make a serious change ahead of 2024 and needs to not clear the field for losing candidates, not back losing candidates, but propping up the strongest and the most formidable ones for a general election. But given the history of the GOP over the past 3 years, I don't have much confidence that that's what's going to happen. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.